This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
I'm going to start just with a couple of very quick questions to each of the panellists before we get into the discussion proper. And I'm going to start with you, Frank, and ask you, how do you want to die?
I'd like to die peacefully. I'd like to die fairly quickly. I'd like to die with loved ones around me. I'd like to die with good, competent medical assistance. And I'd like to die in an ambience where there was love and concern.
Lionel?
Well, I'm torn because I'm tempted to say as fast as possible and when my back is turned.
That's inviting trouble.
But I do think that there's a curious advantage to being given a heads up, usually through a terminal illness. And that is, I guess especially for a writer, there's something precious about being able to contemplate the abyss and to finally have a moment in your life to look backwards at it and wonder, what the hell was that? So maybe given a choice, I might take the latter.
Okay. Philip?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's anything to be gained from having the element of surprise in the whole event. So I'd like to know exactly where and when and in particular how, and I think that choosing my own time and my own place, depending on circumstances, when it seems like the right thing, I want to know I can do that. And I suppose in some ways I'm lucky enough to be in that position.
Dennis?
Well, I actually have a quite different position to Lionel and Frank. I would rather go to sleep and not wake up without any knowledge that that was going to happen.
Without knowledge?
Without knowledge, yes.
Okay, well, we'll come back to some agency in a moment. My second question, which leads into the first sort of formal topic of this panel, is do you think that the law, Frank, do you think the law should be there to help us if we need it?
Sure. Law, particularly in a pluralist democratic society like Australia, it should be there to ensure what we might call the common good, the public interest. It's got to have a particular eye to those who are vulnerable, but it's also got to ensure an adequate range of self-determination, autonomy for those who are able.
So you would support the so-called assisted suicide law?
No, well, I'd want to see what were the governing factors at play, in that what I'd want to see is some balance which the law has to strike between the autonomy of the self-determining individual over against the protection that there's got to be there for the vulnerable. And I think that's what, jurisdictions like Canada and Oregon have been wrestling with, and that's what we see also being played out in places like Netherlands and Belgium.
Is this a bit of a heretical position for somebody who's a Catholic priest?
I don't think so. One of the simplistic things in the public square is to run together, particularly for a Catholic priest, you've got this moral position on something as your personal view as a person of faith, therefore you want to impose it on everybody else. Well, that's nonsense. Even in the Catholic Church at the moment, those of you who know anything about the Catholic Church, you'd know one of the leading theologians of the 21st century has been Hans Kung. Well, he's just published the third volume of his autobiography, and basically he's probably closer to Philip than to me on this sort of approach. So what you've got to do is distinguish out moral reflections for people of faith in their own community, what you'd want for your own loved ones, but I think that's a very different debate from what you'd have in a society like Australia, where you're trying to get the balance right for everybody, not just those who share your worldview.
Mm. Lionel, you live part of your time in London and part of your time in New York. Are you able to tell us anything at all about the legal situation in either or both of those cities when it comes to assisted suicide?
Well, the situation in the UK is ambiguous in a way that I think is in some ways abusive of loved ones, and that is the law is that assisted suicide is illegal. There are a lot of British citizens that end up going to Dignitas in Switzerland. And if you help someone make that journey, you could be arrested. And yet, the British authorities are not exactly enforcing the law. So everyone's left up in the air. And I think that it needs to be made clear. It's a state-by-state issue in the United States, and Oregon has what would be regarded as a very permissive or progressive law. and does allow assisted suicide under strictly limited circumstances. I think that makes it an outlier. In most states, it's simply illegal.
I'll come back to you in a minute, Philip, but Janice, can I ask you first, what's your position about legalising assisted suicide?
Look, I'm strongly in favour of it, and I start from the sense that we all reach a point in our lives where we worry more about living too long than dying too soon. What I find most interesting about the situation in Australia is that every opinion poll I can find shows that a vast majority of people in Australia support some form of legalising euthanasia. I mean, obviously the questions vary depending on what poll you're looking at. But with the one very brief exception of the Northern Territory, whose legislation was then overridden.
We'll come and talk about in a minute with Philip. Yes.
No Australian state has come close to doing this. And I find this particularly odd in an era when we have a government that constantly tells us about their mandate and yet have no compunction whatsoever in ignoring what is a very clear expression of public opinion. We just saw this... just to finish, we just saw this very recently in New South Wales, and the bill that was introduced, the Rights of the Terminally Ill bill last year, had no chance of passing, even though the great majority of voters in New South Wales supported that bill.
And this does raise, we'll come back to the legal situation in a minute, but it does raise a very interesting question about the extent to which our state and federal legislatures in this country are so out of tune with voters on a lot of these social issues, and that would include abortion, stem cell research and other comparable issues which even 10 years ago the federal parliament would exhibited support for in a way that would be inconceivable today. So it's an interesting thing that has happened, that we are electing people who don't actually represent what we think.
I think that's absolutely true, and in fact my sense is that at both federal and state level our legislatures are becoming more socially conservative as the population generally is becoming less socially conservative, and that gap is widening.
Big worry. Philip, you started off with the legislation that Marshall Perrin brought in, the first and so far only successful piece of legislation in this country to enable assisted suicide. Now, the outrageous thing about that, as you tell the story, and I'm sure, judging from the audience response, many of us would feel the same way, that the federal government stepped in and forced the repeal of that legislation. Can you just briefly remind us what happened?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't just the first in Australia, it was actually the first legislation in the world. And the Northern Territory, which is where I've been living for most of my life, is not normally known for its progressive legislation. Usually quite the opposite, but in this rare occasion, suddenly, almost falling out of the sky, came the Chief Minister, Marshall Perrin, with this idea. And
what drove him? Do you know what
Well, I do know what drove him, because we've talked about it. Most people think it was because there was some personal incident, but it was actually not. He was actually motivated by a speech he saw of Helga Kuza in Monash University when she spoke there, and he thought this was a clever thing to do, and he was in a position as the Chief Minister of the Territory to do it. And I heard about it and thought it was a good idea and went back to sleep. I've been working there as a relatively young, not young in age, obviously, but I went back and did medical school late in life. But I hadn't had much experience, and I just thought it was a good idea. And I was really taken aback by the intense opposition that straight away came in first from the medical profession, who said there wouldn't be a doctor in the Territory who would cooperate. In other words, they were saying, this law is not going to function and we'll make sure we thwart it. And then the church moved in, or elements within the Conservative Church, in particular the Catholic Church. And then we started to hear about rumblings in Canberra. This law wasn't going to last, and it only lasted 8 months. But for a brief time, if you satisfied strict conditions, you could get lawful help to die. And if you contrast that to where we are now, especially in a state like Western Australia, do the same thing here in Western Australia, the possible penalty is the most savage the state can issue. That's life imprisonment in a West Australian prison for acting generally out of compassion and love.
For doing what? Exactly what?
Advising, counselling or assisting is the way the law is structured. And that can be, it's a little bit woolly, but clearly if your wife's sick and so sick she can't organise things herself, and she asks her husband to nip over to Mexico and bring back the Nembutal, which she can easily do, and then gives it to her very sick husband out of compassion and love, she's the one, not her husband, who will in fact die peacefully, but she's the one who might spend the rest of her life rotting in some West Australian prison. So that law is cruel, and it's already been pointed out, it discriminates against the most sick. Because if you're well enough to kill yourself, the law doesn't care. Suicide's not a crime. But if you're so sick you can't manage that act yourself and need assistance, that person can pay one hell of a price.
Okay, Frank wanted to say something.
As Philip knows, I'm happy to confess, I played a bit of a role in getting the feds to intervene up there in my role as a Catholic priest. There were two things of major concern to me at the time. One was that the Northern Territory had the worst palliative care services in the country, and I thought there needed to be something done there. But a lot of my work, as people probably know, has been in terms of Aboriginal rights. A lot of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, and they, as a group, were very scared about this proposed law. They thought the safeguards weren't good enough. Now, that's not to impugn the integrity of someone like Philip, it's just to say that for Aboriginal people in remote communities, there was a true horror at the thought that they might go to a hospital in Darwin or Alice Springs and that a doctor might administer a lethal injection. Now, the safeguards on that, the public education on it, at that time, I think were very inadequate.
But there was an incredible scare campaign, wasn't it, saying this is a genocidal law? I mean, what was the evidence that could happen?
The evidence was in terms of listening to Aboriginal people themselves on those remote communities. It's not as if, people like me weren't out there to tell them to be scared, but what was being fed back, you didn't have to listen to people like me, people like Chips McAnulty from the Northern Land Council, who went and gave evidence to the Senate inquiry. He said, don't often agree with Father Brennan on lots of things, but on this, have to tell you that we've done the surveys of the Aboriginal communities and they're very worried about this. Now, I think genuinely we've got to be attentive to those concerns. We've got to educate the community if there's going to be legal change.
Yes, but the answer to a law that people don't understand is not to change the law to fit because they don't understand it. It's to make them understand it. So it is.
Let's get back to the question of that was. Okay, we're off.
I'd like to say one point about this. The casting vote was by Wes Lanapoy, a black member of that Territory Assembly who made one of the most eloquent speeches. It was down to the last vote, 12-12, locked up. I went back to work thinking it was all over because the last vote was a black vote. And he got up and gave the most eloquent speech. He said, I don't think I'll ever use a law like this. I don't think my people at Nhulunbuy will ever use a law like this. But I don't see any point in standing in the way of people who see this as important. And at that point, the law passed.
But isn't it the case at the moment, without a law in place, isn't it the case that this situation favours those who are healthier, wealthier, more mobile, more savvy, who know what to do? Now, presumably all of us in this room, we either know what to do or we're going to ask Philip afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that I'm sure you're all dying to have asked. First of all, why Nembutal?
Oh, it's the best drug. In the Territory...
Yeah, be more specific.
Well, we could have used anything when the law came in. And so we did a lot of surveys, looked around, and interestingly, and perhaps a little in an unsavoury way, we actually got the best information from the US, which were using drugs to execute people. But that's actually where we settled down on the idea of the barbiturate. Nembutal, a long, proud history of helping people die. Judy Garland, Jimi Hendrix, Marilyn Monroe, all use Nembutal. It works, and it's peaceful, it's reliable, and if you haven't got it out there, go and get it.
Okay, second...
Your line at the book signing will far exceed the rest of ours.
Yeah, free packet with every book, huh? But the second thing, you say this in your book several times, but you very annoyingly don't answer the question you pose, is you say that everywhere you go, people ask you, and you don't give us the answer, once you've got your Nembutal, how long does it last?
Oh, it's got a shelf life of about 20 years if you store it properly. And
in the fridge, carefully.
Yeah, well, look, if you've got Chinese powder, vacuum seal it, and then wrap it in alfoil and put it in the fridge, not the freezer.
Okay. Rewrite? Now, I heard a very sad story.
And don't keep it next to the baking soda.
No. That dinner party could go really awry. But I had a sort of a very instructive story last night in Perth, having dinner with some friends, and we heard about a man who lived in Fremantle who killed himself using the methods recommended by Philip just, I think, a matter of weeks ago. He had an encroaching, disabling disease, and he wanted to take control of things before he was no longer able to do so. And the story as it was told to us last night was he imported his Nembutal from China, that he got it through on the third go. So in other words, it's not that simple even for somebody with the wherewithal. And he then informed his wife and daughter that he was going to do this, but he didn't inform them of the exact time or place because he didn't want to risk, because it's under the West Australian law, that either of them could be charged and go to prison, which meant that he had to die alone. And it just seems to me that this is wrong, isn't it? Shouldn't people be able to choose how they die?
I think so. I think it makes sense for a society for everyone over a certain age should have access to that drug. And if they want to use it for whatever reason, they have that chance. And I think it would actually improve the general health of our society. Many people say you can't go talking about that drug at these workshops, which I run. People will be hearing of the drug, they'll be getting it, they'll be swilling it down and dropping in the gutters of Fremantle. The idea that the only reason we're alive is because we can't work out how to die, and as soon as someone tells us, oh good, let's get into it.
What has struck me about the statistics that I have seen about people who do get hold of the means of killing themselves, even people who are in a lot of pain and terminally ill, a large proportion, I think almost half, don't use it. And so that what it's about, as much as anything, is a sense of control.
Yes. And of course the other side of that is that many people who can't get it do try and kill themselves in ways that may not succeed or in ways that are extremely painful and stressful. And as Anne knows, we have a mutual friend in Sydney who recently killed himself in a way, who had terminal Parkinson's, and killed himself in a way that was extremely unpleasant. And I think primarily because he could not seek medical attention for what he needed.
I think that's another consideration that we perhaps don't think about, and that is, the people who go, say, hire a hotel room to kill themselves and leave a very substantial amount of money for the poor person who's going to find them. I mean, the kind of death that we are talking about, where you basically go to sleep and you die, and it's a very orderly, clean, and other kinds of ways that we can kill ourselves with weapons or with cars or jumping off buildings. I mean, they're very effective, but they're horrible. Particularly for the people who find us. And so I think, we're ignoring a lot of this discussion about assisted suicide and dying with dignity. And the dignity is not just for the person who's dying, but it's also for the people who are implicated afterwards. So do you have any comment on that, Frank?
No.
You agree? Okay. Okay. So then the next question is, there are kind of hierarchies of need, if you like, and people say, well, if you've got an illness or you're in terrible pain or you're dying and you just want to hurry it up, that's okay. But should you be allowed to take advantage of these laws if they were to be enacted just because you've decided, you're lonely, you don't have any friends, you've run out of money, you're bored? Should there be kind of acceptable criteria for death, or is it up to us entirely?
Well, no.
Everybody.
No, I mean, I would just say, I think this is an issue of principle, and I believe that in the same way that you should own your own life, you own your own death. And so I don't especially want the law protecting me from myself on a range of issues, and this is one of them. So yes, as a matter of fact, if I personally decide that, I'm bored with a lot of you, then that's my right to decide I want to opt out. I don't want to be grilled by a doctor, and if my reasons aren't good enough, then I can't do it.
I don't think I can go as far as Lionel. And I'm wondering, Lionel, would you say that was true of someone who's 16 or 17? And we know that the desire for suicide is quite common among adolescents. Would you be comfortable if a 17-year-old takes his or her life because at that time she or he feels, I've had it, there's nothing to look forward to?
Oh, I can see instituting waiting periods. You know, I don't have a problem with certain safeguards, and I think all of these laws are drafted with safeguards. But I'm not sure that we should restrict it exclusively to the terminally ill in a certain degree of pain that we determine from the outside.
There we're in
that kind of
agreement,
thing.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not just about people being terminally ill.
Yes.
But I think we both are in agreement there's a difference between someone in their 80s
Yes.
and someone who's a teenager.
I mean, 17 would be below the age of consent in my bill. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Well, we could draft
17-year-old
the bill
is probably
together.
less likely to go to the doctor and ask for assistance too.
Yes.
I think the 17-year-old, unfortunately, they have their little communities of communication about this thing, and I mean it is a very frightening thing at the epidemic of suicide amongst certain teenage groups. I'm not sure that it's even connected to what we're talking about, though.
No, and I think that in general we're talking about people who can rationally say, I have nothing to look forward to, everything from now on will get worse, there will be physical deterioration. I mean, I saw this with my mother. I know that my mother in the last couple of years, although there was nothing, she did not have a critical fatal illness, she was not in great pain, but she was basically bedridden, she was miserable. She knew that every morning when she woke up, she had nothing to look forward to except everything becoming, you know, slightly worse. Yeah. And the fact is she couldn't have the honest discussion with her doctor that I suspect she desperately wanted to have.
And that, I mean, that really is the trouble with legislation in all of its forms, that it sets out to try and codify a degree of severity before you get access to this path. And generally speaking, people who come along with social reasons are excluded. And we're seeing more and more people these days who are coming along with what we would describe as social reasons for wanting to die. And the laws can't deal with it.
Tell us what you mean by a social reason.
Well, a good example, we had a person who was dying of mesothelioma, the asbestos cancer. His wife said, when he dies, I want to die with him. They've been together for 60 years. And everybody did all they could. The family all rallied. They did everything they could to tell her that there was a life after the death, inevitable death of her husband. But she wasn't about to change her mind, and really the only option left to all of them was to perhaps have her psychiatrically certified, because she was saying, I'm going to do this. And they went over to Mexico, they got the Nembutal, they brought it back to country Victoria, and they write a very compelling note, and they drank their Nembutal together and died together. That's exactly what she wanted. Now, if she'd come up to Darwin when he had that law, he would have said to her husband, yeah, sure, you can get help to die, you're terminally ill, and tell Iris, his wife, go back to Victoria and wait around for a while until you get really sick, then come back. I mean, it doesn't encompass, that's a social reason, and we're seeing more and more of it now, and it goes under the name of tired of life or the like. But I think that's going to be a problem of legislation whenever it's imposed, and in fact, the models that are being proposed now in Australia are getting tougher and tougher and tougher, all in an attempt to try and get them through Parliament, because it's so damn hard, you're going to have to be just about dead to qualify.
And not even then.
I mean, Philip, you say in your book, I sort of found this quite compelling, you say, every day I see people quietly using their drugs and leaving the planet. And you go on to say, making a different point, it is good that they have that choice, but I just wish that they'd spoken out before they went. The activist in me can be hard-hearted at times. I mean, you're wanting people to go out with a bit of sloganeering. But what I took from that was that, do you have any sense of the number of people who are in fact choosing to go this way?
I've never seen so many people successfully able to import the drug as there is right now, 2014
How do
in
you
Australia.
measure that?
By our own feedback. I mean, we've got a workshop tomorrow in Perth. It's going to be one of the biggest we've ever held. There'll be about 200 75-year-olds coming along, and they will all want to know, how do I get my drugs, or what other methods, and there are other methods that are peaceful and reliable. So they want to know that, and we get quite a lot of feedback from them. Obviously not from all, But we get a lot of feedback, and that's where we know that the drug is becoming easier, and that's all because of the internet. And I suppose, the fact that the authorities, in a general way, have been doing all they can to try and stem the flow, but by the same token of all those interceptions, and you alluded to two, there's never been a prosecution. And what that means, of course, is the state is quite keen to confiscate your Nembutal, but it's very unenthusiastic about putting you into a courtroom, because all that will do is attract a lot of attention to the failings of the state, because that's what's driving people down this path now.
But I mean,
So why the need to change the law?
Well, because you lose your money. That would have been about $1,000 lost, 2 lots of 500, and then the third attempt, the $500 got them their 10 grams of powder. So I don't think people want to spend their time looking at the tracking number and seeing it goes to Australian Customs in Sydney from China and then it just stops. And that's the common experience. We can do better than that. I mean, it should be available. Over a certain age, and people say, what age? Teenagers? No. I said adults once and got kicked to death because you can be 18 and an adult, and everyone said you can't have teenagers doing this. So I thought, all right, people with a life experience, let's make it over 50. Everybody over 50 really shouldn't have to go through this. They're becoming effectively criminals in their twilight years, importing prohibited drugs, and they shouldn't have to do that.
But I think also, Frank, one of the reasons you changed the law is that not everybody in this situation has people, even if it were possible, to help them import the drug or have the wherewithal. It's not just the $1,000.
Or the money.
Well, it is partly the money, but it may also be, do they have enough physical control?
Internet skills.
Exactly. I mean, we all can do that. Fine, but again, I do think back to my mother. I think back to the people in the home where she ended up. Now, a friend of my mother's was supposed to move into that home, and the day before, she threw herself off the balcony of her apartment block because she could not face. And I think it was an extraordinarily brave thing to do, but what a terrible way to do it.
And a very common thing to do, because one of the other things that I think is salient to this discussion has been the extraordinary reticence, by and large, of the media to write about suicide. When they normally only do it when a death is so public that it can't be ignored, such as Charlotte Dawson, the model who killed herself yesterday. But generally speaking, suicides are not reported, or where they are, they're reported in a very bland way with the lifeline advice at the end. And yet you do know anecdotally from stories like this, the number of people, particularly elderly women, who kill themselves by jumping off buildings in Sydney is horrific, really horrific. And I think for a person who has no money, who can't get to Mexico, who can't spend $1,000 importing a drug from China, who's frail, what are your options? And this to me is such an unfair burden if we're not going to make it kind of easier for everybody.
I mean, the commonest method used in Australia, 2014, by the elderly to take their lives is by hanging. It comes up every year in the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures, and of course it's easy to see why. They can't get access to drugs, they don't have the money or the wherewithal, and the drugs are restricted, but hell, there's no restriction on rope, and everyone knows how to do it, and the other thing about it is it works. It doesn't fail, but it's a grim and a horrible death, and it's the commonest by far.
So when we went round at the beginning of this and asked how we wanted to die, none of us said we wanted to hang ourselves. And I don't think any of us would want to, and hopefully don't have to.
So if you want some advice, I've read about this, and it's really important to jump from a high enough height that you break your neck. You don't want to strangle.
Yes.
Strangling is horrible.
Yes, I think having just read Hilary Mantel on some of these things. So then the question becomes, I guess, what do we expect from life? Is living a long life a goal in itself, or is it a good life? Is it a healthy life? Is it what should be the parameters of our decisions about when we want to go? Do you have any thoughts on this, Frank?
Well, we're very much an ageing population, aren't we? I mean, the percentage of those over 85, I think it's by 2050 it will have gone up 3 times. So we are going to be a very ageing population. And I think amongst the aged, I think what most people want is a good quality of life, and they also want a good quality of death. Now, how that's to be done is what we're wrestling with here. I mean, for example, one thing I think I'd want to insist on for the social good, if we do ultimately go down this path, I would want people like Philip to be in a distinct specialty, that is the death doctors. Not that there's a lot of special expertise to be had, but I'd want to quarantine that role from the usual medical role, where when you go to the doctor, you know that the doctor is there in order to enhance your life. But if you've made the option for death, that there is a specialty available where it can be utilised.
Well, I mean, there's a big question about what the hell doctors are doing in this whole process anyway, because death is not a medical process, and yet we've medicalised the hell out of it now, and doctors have almost insisted on controlling the whole process, so you feel like you're some sort of failure if you actually die without someone in a white coat standing alongside you. Now, I don't think that's the right... I mean, death is natural. We're all going to do it, and the idea that we have to have a doctor, I think, is not necessary, and that idea of having other people, it's would work quite well. I mean, you don't have to have any great experience, but you do have to have access to the best substances and products.
But of course, the other side of this is that many of us will die in a medical setting. And I'm speaking from personal experience. My partner died 14 months ago. He died in a hospital of lung cancer. They asked me, and it's very interesting, Frank, it was a Catholic hospital. There was absolutely no question that I was treated as next of kin. And they asked me, how much intervention do you want? And luckily his oncologist had already talked to us about this and was very clear that there was not to be a great deal of intervention. And in a sense, he died, yes, naturally, but in a totally unnatural setting, right? In an intensive care unit. That is the reality with an ageing population. Many of us will die that way. And, when you ask that first question, I guess my great hope is I don't die that way, that I die before I end up in the intensive care situation.
Well, that overwhelmingly, when people are polled, they say they don't want to die in hospital, and overwhelmingly they will die in hospital. And for enlarging the discussion here, I think that is something that we need to somehow get control over. If your partner knows that he's dying and you're reconciled to that as well, and there is going to be very little intervention, can't we get better at providing palliative care and pain relief in the home setting?
In fact, it was so quick and so unexpected that he was literally in hospital for 24 hours, and the hospital did not...
That makes him lucky.
He was lucky, and to be honest, I was lucky. I mean, it came much faster than anybody, including... Because that afternoon, they had told me he's stable. 3 hours later, he died. So, and I think at some level, he chose to die that way. And I mean, this is... Philip and Frank may know much more about this. My sense is it is often the case that people do choose the moment of their death.
Yes.
Sure.
Absolutely.
I've done 2 funerals in the last fortnight. Each one, cancer. I mean, they wait till the relatives fly in from overseas, they're there around the bed, and he says, that's it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put a lot of hope in your ability to just pick that moment.
No, and I'm not good at timing, Philip.
This raises another question, of course, about the medicalisation of not just of death, but of old age generally. And as we are an ageing population, as we develop more and more illnesses, and the medical profession is able to help us deal with them in ways that would have been inconceivable, even 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, when if we made it to 70, we were doing well. But I mean, there is an increasing tendency for the medical profession to say, well, you might be 85 or you might be 92 or you might be whatever age and you're very sick and you're probably not going to live much longer, but we can just do this one more thing. It's one more operation that's not only going to be very costly to the community in terms of our medical benefits, medical bills, but it's also going to be intrusive on that person. It might give them an extra couple of weeks of life. I mean, are we going too far down this track?
Well, it always comes to the dignity of the individual and having the choice. I mean, there are limits on the resources that you've got, But one of the things we've got to do as a society is make available to people what they think is necessary. I mean, there's no obligation. I mean, even in old-style Catholic moral theology, no obligation to take on something which is futile or something which is oppressive. I lived with a Jesuit mate of mine a few years ago. He had a blood condition. I remember going with him on the day to the doctor where the doctor said to him, well, now we'll have to start dialysis. He just said, I'm not going to have dialysis. And he died 3 months later. And he had a very good death.
Yeah.
And guess what? Even in the old Catholic way, nothing wrong in that. Perfectly good death, perfectly good life.
But it's often very difficult, though, for people, particularly if they're already within hospitals, to refuse treatment. They don't have the information. They obviously don't have the power to stand up to doctors.
No, with respect, that's not a problem. I'm on the board of the biggest Catholic health provider in the country. I know something about these things as they work. I mean, think back, Philip had something to do with it. I think, remember you here in WA, that Christian Porter case some years ago. I mean, there was no need to go to the courts in that case to get a court order to allow him to withdraw himself from hydration, nutrition, whatever. But basically, once the court order was made, he did live on. Why? It seems because there were people who took an interest in his life. Some nurse came along and started taking his life history and things of that sort. It's not that the law obliges you to accord yourselves of these things. It's there. The law is already formulated in terms of freedom and self-determination.
I guess all of us have this, and certainly the older we are, the greater the fear. And certainly my mother had this fear of losing, and she died when she was 82, about 10 years ago. But the fear of losing control of your life, losing your driver's license, losing your house, having to live in a nursing home.
Sure.
Gradually, that's long, slow deterioration. And we all know people who have said they do not want to go that way, and they have been forced to. And I think we all have that fear. And I don't see that the law that we're talking about can actually address that, which is our greatest fear, unless we, as individuals, decide to take control, perhaps a little earlier than our so-called natural lifespan might turn out to be.
I mean, people often have when you ask them and talk to them about it, they often have in their own minds an idea of what that tipping point, for want of a better term, might be. And they'll often say things like, if I have to leave my home and go to an institution, that's it. And if I've got the drugs, that's when I'm going to take them. And sometimes I say, and I often do say, well, why don't you try this nursing home? It might turn out to be great. And sometimes it is. But then a new position will be set and say, the minute I get to a stage where someone has to clean up after me, that's going to be the point. And I suppose the way to deal with these situations is keep saying, well, keep on putting your own decision, try these things, see how it goes. But there's no doubt that in all of those instances, knowing that you could take that step is so fundamental. If you feel that you're going to be trapped like that, it becomes a very difficult situation. And my mother sits in a nursing home in Adelaide now, and every time I see her, she's saying things like, I wish something could be done about this. And it's a difficult, difficult situation. And so watching her plight and thinking, don't get into a situation like that, because you don't have to be. She sees herself in the age of 95 now, 94, that her friends have gone. She's not dying, but she's not happy with where she is.
Is she asking you for help?
Yes, she is asking me for help. And puts me into a difficult position.
Legally, apart from anything else.
Well, and not just legally. I mean, I would have thought.
Well, I actually don't mind the idea. I mean, I think that I would like to be able to do. I'd like her to have the drugs, frankly. I don't know whether she'd take them, but that's not the point. The fact is that she might say, well, that's good, now I feel a lot better. A lot of people do say, it's like an incredible antidepressant getting these drugs. People walk out and they're happy. It actually increases longevity, paradoxically.
Because you've got choice.
Well, it makes living into a positive choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you go storing your Nembutal in a nursing home.
But with difficulty. There's a lot of people out there who might just steal it.
Again, I guess a final question before we go to the audience and see what questions that you might have. Do we see there any likelihood of a change of law in this country? I mean, given what happened in Canberra with the Northern Territory legislation, the Western Australia law, which I was unfamiliar with, which is, a prohibitive law, has anybody got any information about where we're at legally?
I don't have information, but I'd like to make one legal, political point, particularly for those who aren't lawyers. Often in this debate, people think it's Canberra because of what went on with the NT. But it was only Canberra because the Northern Territory was a state. Basically, these issues are not Canberra issues, they're state issues. So it can only be at the state level that these matters will be dealt with. But other than that, I don't know.
And so New South Wales has just been knocked back.
Well, my sense is quite pessimistic. I don't see, given the current mood of Australian politics, I cannot see any jurisdiction except perhaps the ACT where this could happen. And were it to happen in the ACT, I would anticipate that the current federal parliament would do what they did in the case of the Northern Territory. I mean, Frank's of course right, but the territory's laws can be overridden by federal parliament. And unfortunately, the person who was instrumental in overriding the Northern Territory law, Kevin Andrews, is still,
back in town.
I think, to everybody's great shame and misfortune, a senior minister in the current government.
Yeah, and in fact, the ACT can't do it because Kevin Andrews' bill passed through federal parliament, making it impossible for people who have the misfortune to live in the Northern Territory, the ACT, or Norfolk Island, our three territories. You can't have euthanasia legislation. But could it come into a state? And we actually had very high hopes for Tasmania, where for the first time in the last 18 years, the Premier pushed it. Lara Giddings was prepared to take on what is the inevitable pressure that comes on any politician and as a leader of a major party, and it still didn't get through. So I don't know, I'm feeling a bit pessimistic, but also there is a certain inevitability about it. The world's changing. Every year, another state in America. Every year, fierce debates in Canada and New Zealand. It'll happen here sooner or later, but as I say to people, don't hold your breath, or perhaps you should.
Meanwhile, Philip runs his clinics, and I guess if you just Google Nembutal, internet, China, I guess the information will pop up, is that right?
That's right.
I want to know what Customs does with all this Nembutal they've confiscated. The families of Customs officers are all set, right?
Probably. They probably put it in boogie boards that go to Bali.
I'm now going to ask the questions, if the audience would like to ask any questions. I think we have microphones. Do we have microphones? Yes, people, the red T-shirt man in the red T-shirt has the microphone. Please put your hand up. There's a hand up here.
I just want to make a comment.
Turn it into a question, please.
Thanks. I'm interested in the point at which doctors begin to, we're speaking about the medical establishment, begin to sort of lose interest in prolonging your life. But I'm in the position of, being told to continue with the cholesterol, even though the cholesterol medication, even though, everything warns against that. So I guess I want to ask anyone who wants to answer how far this medicalisation business goes. I resist taking medications and being cheered along because, you all want to live a very long life, don't you? I want to be able to just say, well, I'm not sure yet. What do you think of that idea?
It only goes as far as you want it to go. You tell your doctor where to get off. But we all know people, some of them are our next door neighbours, who say, I will try anything to live longer. Now, that's fine too. And if they can afford it, and if we've got a health system that does it. But for those who want to say, look, I'm sick of the medicalisation, that's it. I mean, I've got two 85-year-old parents. My mother's a doctor. No way she wants to go near doctors. That's it.
She doesn't need to.
Well, she does, but I think my father is a lawyer. He's a bit different. He likes doctors.
You're very well set up, aren't you, Frank?
And the son's a priest.
Well, I think part of the answer is a gestalt change in the medical profession, because what patients can so easily get sucked into is the fact that the doctors regard patient death as failure, personal failure. And that's one of the things that, you end up wanting to please your doctor. And to please your doctor is to stick around another week. And I think doctors themselves have to come to a more sophisticated perspective on death itself, and that it is not personal failure on their part. It is an inevitable part of life, and it is partly the patient's decision.
I'd just like to ask, what are your thoughts on the recent decision in Belgium to allow terminally ill children to end their lives?
Look, I get been asked that quite a lot lately, and I think that it's actually a very positive development in Belgium because of the following reasons. When the laws came in these countries, they came in after the Northern Territory, but like the Northern Territory, they were restricted to adults, people over the age of 18. The Dutch realised fairly quickly, they brought their law in 2001, that terminal illness is no respecter of age necessarily, and you certainly can be a dying teenager. And it seems a little bit cruel to say, well, you'll have to wait till you're 18 if you ever get that far before we'd be able to help you die. So they dropped it to 12, the Dutch did. And there was a huge international outcry about it. Oh my God, this is a slippery slope in operation. Now the Belgians have come out in the last month, as we know, many of you will have heard, to actually remove the age barrier completely. And I think that makes sense too, because simply having an age barrier of 12 presents problems. It's very strict. It is now being decided not by adhering to some criteria of age, but through consultation between parents, they have to agree, doctors have to agree, the child has to understand what's involved, and they have to be a child who's about to die. And in the 10 years that Holland dropped its age to 12, 5 Dutch children used that, in that group, teenagers used it. No one expects many Belgian children to use this, but I think it just gets rid of one of the anomalies. Yet for the rest of the world is almost in paroxysms about what's happening in Belgium. The Russians aren't even going to allow Russian children to be adopted by Belgian parents from now on because they might get put down. It's bizarre.
Hello. I work in aged care, and yes, you can have minibar in your room. The problem will you be able to access the minibar without some help?
Yes.
And my concern is that perhaps if I can't physically do it, I have to implicate my children, and also when I lose the mental capacity to say, I want you to give that to me now, that really concerns me.
Yeah, but that's not solved by legislation easily, and none of the legislative models around the world at this stage encompass people losing capacity.
Oh, hi. Is that the one? This one's for Philip, or really anyone else who might answer. Are you aware of, and how do you feel about advanced health directives, sometimes known as living wills? So, do you know about them, and how do you feel about them?
Well, I'll just briefly say, and I'm sure other people will say, they're great things and we should all have them, but of course they don't allow you to ask for help to die. There is some progressive models of legislation for euthanasia, such as the New Zealand model, which tries to incorporate them into that, so that they're also going to say that if I lose capacity, unable to communicate, I can have my life ended. But none of those laws have ever passed yet. But certainly one should have one. What it says, of course, is that when you can't speak, you don't have treatment. It doesn't say you can get help to die.
Yeah, and I strongly support this, and I have done a living will. And,
This is for any or all of the panel. One of the things I've noticed recently from the people who oppose this idea is that there's the possibility of pressure being put on the aged by their relatives or friends that they really should stop living. Now, I'm interested to find out from the panel whether they think this is just a furphy, but if it's being used as an argument, what is the counter to that argument?
Who wants to?
Actually, I think that's a very good question, and it's what I wanted to ask you, Philip, because I hear this all the time as well. And you know, it's a stereotype of these hideous predatory relatives who just want their mitts on your money, and you're this frail, it's always a woman, granny who doesn't want to be a burden and will do whatever she's told. And yet I never hear any real, even anecdotal evidence of this actually happening. And I was curious, Philip, whether or not the opposition has marshaled statistics that show that this has been a consistent problem with more permissive laws.
No, I've never seen any statistics that say that, but it's always invoked as a possible development, and that would be evidence of a slippery slope, and because it could happen, we shouldn't go there, we shouldn't go down that legislative path. But I've never seen it either in the same sort of situation. But I think the counter to it is, okay, pressure can be brought to bear, we all acknowledge that. But pressure can be brought to bear by avaricious relatives in all sorts of ways. And of course, currently, we often see pressure being brought to live on, to fight, to keep on struggling. And you see people, I get at the bedside of people who quietly tell me, I just wish I could go, but the family will want me to get in there and take this new treatment. So you can have pressure in both ways, and it cuts both ways. And I don't think there's any real way around it, except that in the legislative models, the person themselves has to ask on the day they die that they want to do it. Not the children or anyone else, the individual has to do it. Are they being subject to some clandestine behind the curtain pressure? I guess you don't know.
If you've got kids like that, surely you should just take them out of your will.
Yeah.
One group in the community where I know there has been research on this is people with disabilities. In the UK a couple of years ago, they did a pretty good survey. I think it was Comres, it's called, 550 people with disabilities survey. The interesting thing was 35%, I think it was, thought that there could be some added pressure on them to end their lives. But more interesting, 70% thought there could be pressure on other people with disabilities to end their lives. So, you know, people seem to have a sense that, you know, I may have disabilities, but I'm pretty coherent and self-determining in myself, but I am worried about someone else I know who has disabilities. I don't know that they'll be up to it. Now, once again, I mean, these are real perceptions that are out there, and they're the things that have to be addressed through any legislative model. If I might just add one other thing, hearing Philip today, I suppose if I were in the pro-law reform lobby, I'd be wanting to get clarity on, are we wanting to go one of two ways? Is it to be, look, basically it's time for the state to get out of all of this and people should be able to end their lives for whatever reason? Or is it about end-of-life decisions for people who are terminally ill, where yes, we will have strict governance procedures so that everyone can be assured that it only applies there and that it doesn't infect other social relationships? I think that's the big policy challenge.
Thank you. There seems to be an elephant in the room which nobody's addressing, and that I work in mental health. And it seems to me that there's an assumption that people have capacity to make these very significant decisions in their life. And as though once you have the capacity, it doesn't fluctuate. You know, one day you wake up quite in the morning, you're feeling a bit depressed. Well, yeah, between 9 and 10, I'll kill myself. Between 12 and 1, when I'm having a good time at lunch, I won't. It seems to me that and how are you going to deal with the mentally ill people? Are you going to allow them to also just say, well, you've got a bit of a depression? 1 in 4 of people in Australia has a mental illness. You're going to say, let all those people also be free to make that decision? I'd like to know how you would protect the vulnerable.
My own view is that any legislation should have protective measures in there precisely for the protection of the vulnerable.
And the legislative models, by and large, do, and it can be quite onerous. In fact, we forced every person who used that territory law to have a psychiatric examination, and it's the patients hated it. To be told that you had to go and see a psychiatrist to have your sanity tested when they were suffering dreadfully. I dragged those poor people around the various suburbs of Darwin. They could hardly get in a car, but I had to try and get them for their compulsory psychiatric examination. Bill, the third person to use that law, left it to the last day. He said, I don't want to see the psychiatrist, he'll say I'm depressed. Bill wasn't that happy, dying of his stomach cancer, but he was fearful that he wouldn't get his signature. In fact, We created hurdles, and in fact, Marshall Perrin said when he drafted the law, I don't want to make dying people jump through hoops. But by hell, we made them jump through hoops.
And the proposed New South Wales law has a whole set of provisions. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's an enormous problem and it's a growing problem, but the proposed New South Wales law, which is very, very restrictive, does have a whole set of provisions covering that. And I think, as Philip says, the hoops may actually be unjumpable for people who are not mentally competent.
We have time for 2 more questions. There's one here and then one down here.
So I'm an emergency doctor, and I think there's been some mischaracterisation of the medical profession's approach. We get people coming in, old people from nursing homes, demented, faecally urine incontinent, bedbound, and dying, and we're looking for ways to not do things. Our approach isn't that we want to do things. We're looking for a way not to do things, and we often feel that legally we're constrained because, we have to provide treatment or you've got to have a good reason not to. So we're in the situation of looking in the old notes, desperately trying to find that not for resuscitation order they agreed to last time, or trying to contact their next of kin to get hold of them to stop us from having to do anything. And the other scenario is that I think the lady who worked in aged care made a very good point that people don't have the physical or mental capacity. That you'll have people sitting on a ward waiting to die for days after day, not eating, not drinking, in pain, their families coming in every day. And I think we need legislation to address these issues, to protect doctors and to protect patients in this situation. Could you comment on that?
I find it difficult to imagine how legislation would help you further in that, there's already no obligation on you to do anything which is futile or overburdensome. If there's no directive there, then yes, you have to give appropriate medical care. Now, I can't imagine in Australia society wanting to legislate to say, well, in this circumstance where the doctor doesn't quite know what the person wants, but because of their age or whatever, we wouldn't give appropriate medical care. I think one of the good things is that, though you speak of mischaracterisation of the medical profession, I think we in Australia go to pretty great lengths to ensure that there is a zone of self-determination, respect and privacy between doctor and patient, and it's not as if the law comes in with a sledgehammer to say thou shalt. And my guess is that you're probably better positioned than any lawyer to determine what to do in those cases, though they're difficult.
And I think that maybe the change is not legislative. Maybe we need some decent access to the advanced directive that you're rummaging through the notes looking for. Maybe we need a nationwide database so that you instantly have that advanced directive.
Final question down here.
Question for Father with comment. What specific details in euthanasia law in Western Australia would be acceptable to you?
Basically, at the moment, I'm of the status quo position. I think the law in Australia works pretty well. I've learnt that, Philip and his group are able to do all sorts of things at the moment. There's no prosecutions going on. I concede that there are a few cases at the edges where there are still difficulties, but I think they've got to be offset against the other cases which will be at the new edges. I've often used the analogy, it's simple, but I think it's true. I'm one of those drivers who tends to drive at 105 when it says 100. Should you change it to 105? No, I'll do 110. The need to change the law at the moment, what I'm hearing from Philip is it could go one of two ways. Either a one-line entry law which says anyone can have available to them the means for taking their own life if they think it appropriate. The other is a detailed legislative scheme which spells out the restrictions such as the states and jurisdictions have been looking at. But even on that at the moment, I say I think the status quo still works pretty well.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, it's not working. It's not working well. And every year people are sitting in front of juries with juries working out how they're going to spend their next decade. And these are people that are acting out of compassion and love. We've got to change that.
Well, I'd like to thank our panel very much. Father Frank Bannon, Lionel Shriver, is that me? Sorry, Philip Mischke and Dennis Hawke. Thank you all very much. We will all be over at Dimmick's Books signing books if you'd like to come and talk with us there. Thank you very much.